welcome to another episode of Agency Automators. Today I'm here with my good friend Jordan Chu. What's up, dude?
Hey.
And I'm crazy excited to have my other great friend, John Murch, with us today. John is the Director of Software Engineering at Ipolrank. You've done all kinds of amazing things in and out of SEO. Software development's kind of been the through line for everything. Do you want to give us a quick introduction for your background and your bio?
Sure. So I'm John Murch. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I have an undergrad degree from the University of Vermont, go Catamounts, in computer science. Got into SEO with blogs, mostly WordPress, movable type. Was in and out of consulting, doing both in-house and my own work, diving into a bit more of development. And then kind of finally this year going back into SEO, joining the Ipolrank team.
And that has been something that you and Mike have wanted to do for a long time, right? Try to build something pretty amazing.
Yeah, so Mike and I met at, I think it was SMX East, I want to say, and it was because it was him, John Doherty, and it was kind of interesting at that time, and not even realizing at the time I was living in New York City, doing mostly consultant SEO, but then doing a few things in-house side. But it was always just interesting to see all the different players in the SEO space. I realized I feel like I took for granted the fact that being in New York City, you get to expose to a lot of people like that you may not see if you're in other cities or towns.
That is amazing. Okay, so we've got a lot on our plate. Background is cool. All of that stuff is cool. But this is one of those episodes where we get to just nerd out like crazy, right? And there are some things that you've shared with us, some code that we've already seen behind the scenes that we'll get to see. And then also, I really want to dig in, if we can, into this whole concept of like building software for SEO and some of the challenges that you're running into, some of the stuff you knew about, some of the stuff you didn't know about. And of course, I'm going to interrogate you along the way. Do you want to jump in and just kind of show us through your Wayback Machine thing that you built?
Yeah, so I'm just going to share the screen and go through this. So I'll post this up on, actually it is posted up on GitHub, but I'm sure it'll be in the link notes. But this is just basically less than 50 lines of code, and it uses archive.org Wayback Machine CDX. And the great thing about the Wayback Machine is just how much content exists on there. And so basically what this does is it just takes in a domain. You can basically, in this case, we're fetching from the domain, doing a lookup on the URL, outputting it to JSON, then filtering out basically the URL and the status code. And so I can run through this script. It'll take a few seconds to run through. So ASOS, the e-commerce store selling clothes and stuff. But basically, this will give me an output of all the URLs from this site historically. And the advantage here is it gives me a starting point if you're doing like an audit or just, historic data, or just to understand like the scope and size of a site, and, relatively easy. Now, yes, you could use Screaming Frog or something, but having worked on large number of sites, there's different time commitments and resources for that. Whereas with this, it just takes a few minutes and is a simple HTTP request.
That's cool. So, John, how did you come up with this initial idea? What was that aha moment?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like I've been using the Wayback Machine for a while now. Even the CDX is, I want to say it's almost 10 years old now. Maybe it's about 9 or something. But the idea here is just that there's all this content that already exists out there. And for me, it's finding shortcuts and ways to aggregate data without me kind of doing like the normal path, right? Like how can I cheat in order to get to, what I want to accomplish? So here I'm leveraging the Wayback Machine. There was another process of this that I talked about this year in a blog post, but crawling without crawling. So the idea here is to leverage sitemaps in order to get all the URLs for a site without actually crawling the URLs. And so again, if the idea is to take a domain and understand like how many pages, what's the kind of folder structure or segmentation of the site, some of the other kind of nuances with different, areas where content exists, just crawling in general can be, can take a long time. So coming up with ways of doing it. So one is with this. So here, if we take a look, so
only 435,000.
Yeah.
Holy moly.
So yeah. So here it gives me also the status code. And what's fascinating is, so like I can see some of the redirects. And so you could take this list and basically be like, okay, I just want to pull out the 200s and look through that, or, even just understanding like the file folder structure and seeing what exists or whatnot from there. And so it just is kind of interesting. It's like, this already exists. How can I, leverage it? For different processes. And I don't feel like enough people are using Wayback Machine, not just for their own site, but for competitor sites, or to look at, what URLs existed at the time, even a migration ago, because it seems so many sites are migrating every 3 to 5 years or so. So there may be 2 different migrations that happen before, once you start talking to them. So.
Oh, wow. So take us through the URL parameters. Are those Wayback Machine ones, or are they from the original website?
No, so this is just using the CDX. I put an article that kind of calls out a bit more of the params in there. And there are a few others that you could go through, MIME type and stuff like that. Although it can be an issue where like you have a JavaScript file that shows as like an HTML, but it's really a .js file. So like, ideally, this was great to be like, okay, let's take a large site, to understand what are their, pages. And especially in the enterprise, as I said, like crawling an enterprise site becomes very hard over time. And in some cases, you get into cases where, like, say you're an e-commerce store, a product may discontinue or, not be in stock and then come back. And so that page may be done differently during that time. So
tell us about what VS Code plugin you have that does that really cool terminal thing that shows the apple and that. What is that? I don't have that. I want that.
So this is, I think it's just oh my
Fish.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's how this is set up. But yeah, some of these things, I guess, like I both like and not. Like it takes a little bit longer to load some terminals when I open it up, but then once it's loaded, it's fine. But I mean, long story short, this basically just fetches this URL. I just put in the domain. It's using a match type, a prefix. The collapse is on the URL key, outputting in JSON, and I'm grabbing the original and status code. And then I just take that data and then just do a simple transform on the response that's coming back. And I did also want to call out, I do clean up the URL. So one thing is that there's a lot of port 80s in Wayback Machine for a lot of URLs. So I just get rid of them and clean them up. And then I just dump it to a CSV, or you can dump it to JSON or whatever. But again, it's just, fascinating to me that, there's all this data out there that you're, can easily crawl, right? It doesn't really cost you other than storage and time. So.
There's two things that are interesting to me about the way, well, there's more than two, but just a couple to call out. So you're using a for await in instead of like a standard for of or just a standard for loop, you're doing for await. What are you awaiting, and why are you?
Yeah, so JavaScript is quirky, has many quirks, and although dealing with it's basically single threaded, and so there's cases where things can get fired afterwards that you would expect to happen before. And for me, I like to move a pattern where I read top down for my code. And so I just try to write it in an async approach. Now, you are correct. There's probably a quicker optimized way that I could have that, but I definitely like to leverage for awaits just based on the ordering. So in many cases, the difference of time saved in my mind can wait for other optimizations and practice versus just having something like here. So for example, you could have like a worker queue or something like that if it becomes a way that your for loop is too slow.
Okay, in line 19, your pattern of does not equal -1, that's the pattern that you like to lean into to check the existence of something?
Yes and no. So in this case, I basically was using this as like a validate on the data coming back to see that it has that field original in the URL. I definitely like to do just basic validation on a few things to at least get a better understanding of the data comes back. And it's kind of interesting because like I took them out here, but normally I have console logs and like process.exits to basically like to give me a better understanding of what that data that's coming back. And then once I know, I can, move through on how I want to process it.
And for the people at home, they don't know how much you've contributed to like my growth as someone who builds stuff, and how many phone calls and whatever Zooms and whatever, and how much you've taught me. So I just have not embraced the for await. So basically for you, it's not like a semantic, you're not being semantic about it, but you're just ensuring that you stay inside the async await pattern, and it removes any question at all that you'll have any orchestration issues down the road.
Yeah, pretty much. That's like the biggest issue for me is like you may get pretty far into different scripting or services and then realize, hey, this isn't finishing. Oh, I totally broke like some async. There isn't a promise being returned and it's firing later.
Got it. I love it. And then I love that you log out fiend for done versus complete. You use a nice little flourish there.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, yeah. I do seem to have that pattern for a lot of my test code, I've realized. So
nice. And then I noticed if you scroll down that you defined the entire function as an async function, and then you ran it at the bottom. I notice a lot of people, this is how I build, by the way, but I notice a lot of people are creating their test code like this as an IIFE or an immediately invoked function expression. Yep. And I find like my head doesn't gravitate there. I know how to build it, but I always build this way. Is there a reason why you chose this over something else?
No, I mean, for a lot of one-off scripts that I run like this, I normally have like a async function run. I don't know if it's due to like normally you have like a main function in other programs and everything, basically starts from it. But yeah, I like this idea, and that allows me to abstract, each of these sections later on. has definitely been something that I feel like you're always improving or refactoring code based on other needs as you get further down the pipeline.
Nice. Okay, and just because we didn't say this before, I was thinking like, hey, what would someone need to know? We're looking at a code script that's written in node.js for folks at home. Okay, cool. So when we think about the data that's coming back, you can look at this and see segmentation. Are you seeing that just mainly based on folder structure?
Exactly. And one other thing that I also want to pull out, I had a gist about this that actually David Sotomano optimized for me. But one thing I used to do for URLs is basically explode on the folders and then also on the hyphens or spaces, or well, hyphens, underscores, to try to find keywords within URLs as a cheating mechanism. So basically, it would allow me to assign an array of keywords per URL, and then you could obviously group those URLs by those keywords, similar in type of a segmentation.
It's funny you bring that up because our team was in a meeting yesterday and we were thinking of pulling keyword in URL as a field into our tools so that people could have that as like a Boolean checkbox. They could click like, yes, show me all the stuff. And my mind immediately went to one of the websites that broke our tool because we were building n-grams based off of search terms. And if you've ever had to do that, sometimes those n-grams can be very long. And we had search terms that were almost 500. Oh yeah, sick.
So yeah, I don't know why I can't, maybe if I just view it as raw. So this is basically, this is a cleaned up version that David did of mine. Mine required a bit more stuff, but it's basically just taking the URL, the pathing names, so the folders, lowercasing them, splitting them, and then creating a set. And then this basically gives you an array of keywords per URL. So you basically are taking, as I said, you could do it if either Wayback Machine archive.org or even just sitemaps and not even crawl the URLs, just the sitemap URLs, and then build out this. And now you can segment an entire site.
So then you could do kind of like, I don't know, some kind of analysis if it's TF, IDF or whatever to compare a search term that's tokenized against this array, right?
Yeah, so you would take these terms, stem and lemmatize them, or have a lookup for what they may be, and then basically you could do a TF IDF on the URLs. Yeah, that's actually interesting.
Cool. Well, that's what I was thinking about. Okay, so I think we have kind of a unique opportunity here to have one of the smartest, bestest builders in all of SEO with us to like talk about building tools. So how do you approach building tools? Like what's your starting place? How do you think through the process? Like take us through that a little bit. Like how do you like to do it?
Yeah, so I definitely like to think about edge cases and use cases and scale and problems you're going to have, or even just thinking through. It was funny, even as something as simple, something as simple as understanding, like say you have the keyword, you want to group different keywords together, right? Sounds pretty straightforward, right? But then you get into all these like weird cases of permissions or of things where it's like, well, I want a keyword that I group it one way and somebody else wants to group it another. And so maybe it's based on view or something. It could be based on language or something like that. But you start to realize there's all these different assumptions that either people have, or there's these different use cases that you may not even be exposed to because of whatever the problem is. whether it be language or, something local. I always laugh, my wife being from Pittsburgh, there's all these words and nuances that I never realized about Pittsburgh. So there's a thing called a Pittsburgh left, where like if you're at a stop sign and somebody's turning left, normally they would have the right of way to turn left, but they stop and then give you right of way to turn, which totally breaks all logic of how cars flow. But it's a Pittsburgh left.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have use cases and edge cases, but there's more. Right?
Yeah. So basically, your standard use case of whatever it is, you have your edge cases, thinking through of like, okay, when you think about like getting back a response, you should be thinking of like, I always need to paginate through them because at some point there's going to be millions of whatever these items are. And, how do you plan to process that? Or is, where the processing is done. So like thinking about kind of design patterns, if you think of a standard like app or like, let's say a CRUD app, create, read, update, delete. So basically when you're building a CRUD app, you could be like, okay, well, I will edit something and it will get updated, right? But there's processes that you need to be thinking about was what happens if in order to make a change or update, it takes, 10 seconds, a minute, an hour, a day, a week. Like you can't do certain things in real time. And so you have to be thinking of like, what are the limitations and what are the acceptance criteria of those that you're okay dealing with. So yeah, there's I guess a bit technical on thinking through these, but having, built a few different types of products in different industries, you start to realize some of these patterns.
So what's your mental model for identifying, at least on the front end, these edge cases?
Yeah, so normally it has to deal with like where like either two things come together or where like where data will be like it either needs to be fast or is going to be large. Okay. So like you would have an edge case of like, okay, so I have a crawler and it crawls 1,000 pages. Cool. You can have that as one script. You fire that off, right? Now you have a crawler that crawls 100,000 pages. Well, if you do some quick math, there's 86,400, what's it, seconds in a day, right? So 60 times 60 times 24. Yeah, 86,400. So if you have 100,000, it needs to be done more than one per second, right? And if you're doing a million, and that's just thinking like a single thread, a single process. Whereas like, okay, well now say we put this to a database and then you have 10 workers working on that problem. How fast can you do it, right? And then understanding like, what data can be in what temperature. So for example, you'd have like your extreme hot. Yeah. So you'd have like your data comes in kind of different temperatures. So basically hot and cold. So hot would be like cache, like a hash value, key value, and you get into like big O calculations on some of the stuff. But, as you move through of like, well, it sits in an S3 bucket versus like sitting in a CDN versus like it sits in a Postgres database versus it sits on, some other like a service to basically be like an S3 Glacier where it may take, some time to process. You have to understand those constraints when building this. So, there's a lot of kind of, I guess, things to think about with moving data and the use cases of how you want to handle it and some of the other, I guess, kind of common stumbling blocks as you either scale or handle larger amounts.
Interesting. So then when you're building from the get-go, are you kind of testing right away these edge cases, or is it more, okay, I know this proof of concept works and I'm going to scale it out? That's when I factor it in.
Yeah. So normally I see it as kind of like different levels. So as you start to build, you basically want to focus on getting something to work, right? Like a proof of concept and being like, okay, this totally works.
Ooh.
And then, it moves.
John, talk
Yes.
about your philosophy. There's like multiple stages. You've got an amazing way of thinking about this whole progression. You have like 3 things that you call the different stages, right?
Yeah. So basically make it work, make it better. And then it's from one of the Linux books that I've read through.
I thought it was.
Make it fast. Yeah, exactly. So the idea here is that, especially a lot of problems, it's hard to grok and understand all the things that are moving around. So it's better to get something up and running and then to, start to make it work and then make it fast. So.
Very, very cool. How do you like to store data in BigQuery? Are you doing lots of clustering on top of partitions?
It's funny. This is something that I feel like I've been playing back and forth on how I want to do it. So the way I kind of think about it is like, I always like to have like raw backups of files, whether it be like in Google Drive or S3 or something, of some of the raw data. And then in terms of like the tables, obviously in BigQuery's case, you don't want to have any joins really. And so you just want to focus on like, to me, just like simple straight case of a standard table or data set. But I mean, yeah, it's funny because now that they introduced JSON, there's other just like data dumps you could just put in and just not even think about it, right? And just be like, well, it's going to cost a bit more, but it's less development time, and we're just going to keep going until that next, cost happens. So I mean, it definitely depends. I guess that's a good answer in some of these things, but it depends on some of the other problems and stuff.
Yeah.
So like. One way that I've been thinking about some of the data is more of different sets of what you want to look at, right? So like for keyword data, right, you may want to have a table that just allows me to do like a keyword lookup extremely fast by some ID and like have that as a separate like process into itself, right? And then you have like data about the keyword, so search volume, categories, things like that. And that you'd want to be able to look up and see like monthly data or yearly, trends to see where that data is. But then separate from that, you want a background process that's backfilling that data every month or so to keep it fresh. That's separate from your, request, like endpoint on getting this keyword data. And so you have kind of that process. And then you may think through, you need to have like a backfill process on data that you either missed, or maybe there's some other nuances with how that search volume. So maybe that term wasn't really, didn't have any search volume when you started it. And a year later, you realize, wow, it now has search volume. There's kind of another pattern that I think about a lot is basically replay and rollback. So a way to basically replay data for when changes happen that you want to kind of go back and fix, and then rollback data where something like you're importing some file and then realize there's some issue with that file or data and you want to roll back to a previous set state from that. So, I guess these are just kind of some of the patterns that I've started to realize which ones I've liked and worked with.
So you mentioned something super interesting about not wanting to join BigQuery data together. So are you using like a traditional like MySQL Postgres database and then kind of combining it into a single BigQuery table?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of separate. So I like to leverage Postgres. So this kind of gets into more of the temperature side. So BigQuery can take, a few seconds or whatnot. I mean, it depends on obviously the scale of size of data, but your Postgres data should reference an ID and be stored then in BigQuery. So there's cases that you're using Postgres to do lookups without having to go through a massive amount of data to find something. And then similarly, you could use Postgres to get IDs that then you can look up in BigQuery and limit the amount of data in those queries. So I like to leverage both of them.
That's super interesting because you're probably saving a ton of time and money, like as your data set scales up.
Yeah. So think about it this way, right? So like you should have Redis that's basically caching everything, right?
Okay.
And then below that, you'd have like a Postgres, MySQL, whatever, that's handling some of the basic CRUD stuff. And those give you those IDs. And then those IDs are doing like the larger queries to give me like massive amounts of data. What gets kind of weird is when you're presenting data and you present it when one is hitting Postgres and then one's hitting BigQuery, and there's a discrepancy, and that starts all sorts of issues. But understanding which data is being fetched from, which bucket, and, a sync process to basically, re-update BigQuery or, override or create, can go from there. So there's a lot of kind of, I guess, lessons learned as you start thinking through some of the stuff, as well as long-term storage. So there's a lot of stuff in BigQuery after a year, 2 years, 3 years, you probably just want to dump to an S3 bucket, throw in Glacier and have the historic, but you don't necessarily need it in BigQuery. And if somebody asks for it, that's just a longer process to pull.
Can we dive into, let's talk about what you're doing at Ipolrank? Because I think you're building some pretty cool tech that most people don't know about yet. So yeah. Can you take us through some of the stuff you're working on? What can you talk about?
So it's kind of funny. Mike had a post about basically the renaissance of rank tracking. So the long story short is the project I'm working on is called Exact Science. It's a rank tracker. Rank tracking has been around for a long time. And ironically, I used to run a SaaS rank tracking back in 2007, which led to a lot more consulting work back then. But basically, rank trackers haven't really innovated the way Google has innovated on the SERP. And I get to look at a lot of data and some of these other nuances and features that, some rank tracking have things like pixel height, others may have indentation to be able to track that, but you get into a lot of kind of interesting insights as you see data over time trending. So for example, you may see a SERP change, and have a featured snippet or, change different types of rich snippet attributes. But it's interesting because from our standpoint, like some of this stuff, you may, most rank trackers just give you a number or maybe some other info. Whereas what Mike and I are working on is basically going that next level and building these things that we feel like should exist, but don't.
Give us some examples, because that's where that's the juicy stuff.
Yeah, so the pixel height is definitely something that we've done. The indentation is another. The SERP features. So it's actually kind of funny being able to track paid in a SERP for organic. So seeing where it is, because the easiest way now to identify it is your pixels go down or go up because obviously there's an ad up top or whatnot, right? And there's a lot of other kind of nuances. So a lot of SERPs now have the FAQ question within them, but being able to track that type of information, and then taking all of your SERP data that you have and integrating an overlay with GSC data so that you'd be able to say, okay, well, this term on this day had this many impressions and clicks, and this is where it ranked on that day. So you do have like a lagging behind of a few days based on how this is all happening. But it's pretty fascinating to get to kind of see this type of data.
One thing, I had a great conversation with a guy on an agency that pretty much just deals with algorithm impacts whenever algo changes happen. And one of the things that I gleaned from the conversation was just how important it is to have rank tracking in place so that you could track how SERPs are changing, how potentially SERP features and also the intent of a specific search is changing. Because sometimes you might see that you're like getting hosed with traffic, i.e. you're losing traffic, but it's not that there was an algorithm change that was impacting you. It was just that maybe there's like new SERP features. And if you can't see the before, it's really hard to diagnose that stuff.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean,
have that context.
yeah, I mean, you know, when most people think rank tracking, maybe they think of a number or maybe a number and a few other data points or something. But like to me, it's all about actually looking at the SERP. So our tool allows you to look at both the raw HTML as well as what we parsed on the JSON side, and then some of the other insights that we pull out from there. And one thing that I always laugh about rank tracking, normally you just put in a domain or host name or whatever, and it's pulling on that. But you're not seeing the change of the SERP further down other pages or what other competitors are. So you're not saying like, oh, wow, weird. Basically, all these people who used to rank below dropped off. Like, so you'd be able to see like, here is the URLs that are missing from the previous SERP. Here are the new ones that just showed up all of a sudden. And then, you know, basically the change across the entire SERP. So in this case, we're doing 100 results for each what we define as a SERP. And so you're able to see some of these differences, as well as looking at both mobile and desktop for the same keyword, and then being able to do it on different locations, which becomes even more fascinating due to local pack and some of these other use cases.
So how are you visualizing it to the end user in a meaningful way? Because it sounds like it's a lot of data, so it can get overwhelming very quickly.
Yeah, so there's a lot of tables, there's a lot of icons, and then there's a few other insights that we basically pull out in terms of graphs. So like being able to show basically your day over day SERPs by feature. So you could see like, hey, was all of a sudden yesterday and today, there's a huge spike in paid. Like, would everyone turn on their paid? Was there some other nuance? And then being able to even take it a step further and being like, oh, wow, there was paid across the board on mobile, but not on desktop. That's interesting, right? Insights like that. But yeah, mostly tables, icons, and graphics really help with that. The other thing that I've been playing around with now that I have a large data set of a few million SERPs is basically like, how can I identify these things over time, right? And then being able to build that into our software and showcase like, hey, we're seeing like these keywords now have a, featured snippet, this is how you should optimize for that and things like that.
Interesting. So are you using like a custom built like D3 app then on your side, or is it like a Google Data Studio report?
Yeah, so there's two things that so right now it's using a charting library for some of the library for some of the graphs. It will make its way into Data Studio. That is definitely on the roadmap of things. It's kind of interesting because like between Looker, Data Studio, and some of these other things, it seems like everyone wants theirs to look or function a certain way. So, but to me, it's more of like, okay, well, if we just dump this to a CSV or JSON, it's like you could put this into anything. And, it's more of just like, how are you parsing that? How are you modeling that data? And how are you identifying these changes, right? Like, how do you know that there's a new search SERP feature on the page that didn't get processed right? And then, taking a next step further of like, how can we go back in time now, knowing what we know now, and see when these things happened. So
you said a number of things that need to be unpacked, because I don't think people have a sense of scale so much. So what I heard was a few million SERPs. So are
yeah.
you tracking a few million over time, or have you hit the API once for those few million? Like how's that all set up?
Yeah. So basically there's some historic that I have for that, but then obviously every day there's more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. So let's talk a little bit about crawling, common problems.
Oh man, yeah. I've built a lot of bots in my day, a lot of crawling activities of large e-commerce sites. But yeah, I mean, obviously the first one's just understanding like what you're trying to get and like what type of crawler you need to build, right? So like curl is amazing in some cases in order to get certain information. And then obviously you need something like a puppeteer to do different types of, JavaScript rendering to be able to get things. But as we kind of started this whole thing, Wayback Machine and sitemaps are your friend on gathering intel. Even just robots.txt and understanding like, hey, has one of your competitors put up a new sitemap, or what's new in their site now versus last quarter? Maybe we should be checking out those pages. Do those pages now exist for some keywords in the SERP? Interesting things like that.
Hmm.
But yeah, to your point of building and crawling, to me, there's a whole back and forth on being blocked and coming up with creative strategies on that, as well as understanding, processing the data. Some of the data doesn't need to be processed real time. So you can just basically pump and dump and download all of it and then go back later and do all the processing.
Okay. So have you settled on, if you're going to use a JavaScript based crawler, there's a whole bunch of them. There's and if we stay in Node for a minute, we could look at Puppeteer, we could look at, I guess, Playwright, we could look at Cheerio. Have you found a use for either Playwright or Cheerio?
Well, so I guess somewhat make a difference. Yeah.
Yes.
So normally with Playwright, if you need to do usability testing, so to be able to run like Firefox, Chrome, basically browser extensions, or basically be able to mimic different browsers.
Yeah.
Most of the stuff I've done has mostly been with Puppeteer, because I either need to render JavaScript or leverage some of their other more or less just Chrome as a platform on fetching things. So like most people, so there's a pyramid to how all this is done. You basically have like, basically headless Chrome that you could run on the command line to do a lot of things. Don't even need a script or whatnot. You can then have, moving up kind of the chain, like basically dev tools being able to control a remote session of Chrome, and then finally having like Puppeteer running those scripts that mimic Chrome.
Got it. And there's a lot of background to this conversation, which is that I was trying to build a tool that could crawl pages to grab simple things like page titles, meta descriptions, and headings. And I was getting blocked on 30% of my requests. And John and I went back and forth with several conversations on how to architect fallback techniques, meaning you try one way, which is the cheapest way. You then fall back to another way of crawling, which is more expensive to execute. And then you fall back again to an even more expensive and less likely route to get blocked. Something that that I just can't get out of my head. I was talking with someone and they shared with me, I don't remember who told me this, that, one of the largest all-in-one SEO tools that just went public, that 30% of their technology costs are wrapped up in proxies.
Yeah.
And when I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about how we are crawling sites and the frequency with which we're crawling, how that's going to like chew up proxies and contribute to proxy costs. Like, how do you think about that stuff? Like, that's got to come into that's got to be part of like how you're thinking about budget, I would assume.
Yeah. So like, obviously there's a cost for that, but there, to your point, or to kind of to go down, there's different types of costs related to that, right? So one could just be time. So the cost may be cheaper if you spread that process over time. So you may need to use less resources, or maybe you can come up with other means on how you're handling that. In terms of some of the other like kind of blockage or even just proxies and costs, like, there's many ways to do like round robin fetching different proxies to even out the load. There's more of like a fire and burn. So you're just waiting till one of your proxies gets detected and then, move on to the next one and go from there. But you also got to understand, difference between 10 years ago and now is there's so many cloud providers, and like there's, even more so ways of fetching that data. And, it doesn't necessarily even need to be a fetch, right? You could create a browser extension or, something like that that could leverage doing that crawling on your behalf.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay. What are you most excited about exploring next? What gets you up in the morning besides what you're building now? And by the way, you got to tell us the product name and where people can sign up,
Yeah.
and maybe show us on screen so that they'll have a visual for how to find it.
Yeah, I will put that together. Second, we will go through that.
Yeah, thanks.
So you can go here to ipolrank.com/beta-testers, and you can sign up as beta tester. The software is called Exact Science, which is basically our version of a rank tracker. There are a few other tools that we're working on for this. But for us, and even just me, some of the problems, or even just, as the things that get you out of bed, is there's a lot of data, and there's so many interesting things with that. So whether it be ranking data, backlink data, just your standard crawl type data, there's so many problems within that of that either a search engine's trying to solve, or maybe you're trying to optimize for. And there's all these kind of newer cases of things. So take, for example, like Cloudflare workers. You can do different types of rendering on the edge. So this would basically be leveraging a CDN to do different types of transformation or changes there, right? So before, you just had a website, and then maybe you use JavaScript to make changes, right? And then, now you're like, well, actually, I'm using my CDN to make these changes in only these, country locations or other locations that would make to be able to see it. So it's kind of like weird, because you're like, in effect, cloaking and doing these like various things, but a lot of it's for either user experience, or to think through of other ways of improving the page. So to me, it's more of just like there's always problems to be solved, and some of these edge cases, as well as coming up with ways of handling and looking at larger data sets and problems. It's just been so kind of refreshing to like go through and see just how different a SERP is from like a year ago to understanding all these nuances that Google keeps kind of pushing out through, some of their just, updates.
One of the things in my simple crawler that I was building, I was noticing that there were differences between the JSON response and the HTML response, and you had told me to expect that between and that was just like, oh, what is my single source of truth? Dang it.
Yeah.
What do you feed into when you're looking at other people's ways of presenting data? What do you think is the most actionable, HTML or the JSON response coming back?
Well, it's funny because I'm thinking of an example of an e-commerce site where they rendered a URL, the same URL, nothing changed, same parameters, 4 different ways.
Oof.
And some of that had to do with the time of day that you're visiting the site.
Yeah.
And I hadn't even thought about that. Again, this was an edge case that I was like, oh, that's weird, but interesting why they do it. And even now, so you're seeing it in search, seeing is the store open? Is the store closed? Is it the product in stock? Is it not? Is the store about to open? Is there a waiting line? And it's just some of those things. But for me, it's basically experimenting, trying it, the simplest way until you get blocked. And, how does it, change with, the different ways you send it information? Because it's definitely kind of fascinating. If you think about it and take a step back, it's almost like everyone's just throwing stuff at either Google or websites and something's coming back and everyone's making their changes on both ends, right? Google's making a change on their end, we're making a change on our end, and, continue to go from there.
There's so many, it's such a complex problem, and it's almost like playing poker because you only have access to some of the information. We have access to Google's output. We don't know what's behind we don't know what's in the black box necessarily. And we also don't know everything that our competition's doing all the time. We only know what's publicly accessible. I think the thing that I've learned from building the small amount of stuff that I've built is that people don't understand how directional what they have access to really is. That there is no exact truth or whatever, and that they're never going to know everything. And that I think people take the numbers that they see coming out of tools as factually 100% accurate all the time. They don't even think about how it got to that screen. That's been the biggest mind blower for me.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're in a room talking about this because I always ask oh, do you check how do you validate the data you have against it, right? So one example is when we download the HTML and we have our parse data, we can easily see well, did these match, right? Was there something changed? But if you're just getting a number from a site, you have no idea a way to validate that. Once you see these, there's some of these nuances with now you have an indentation or multiple indentations. Maybe you have 4 indentations on a SERP. How are you tracking and counting that versus some of the other competitors who are doing that? So it's definitely interesting. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, going through just some of these problems is more of just it just keeps kind of opening up another box and continuing down. So
well, I gotta say, you inspire me to be a better dev, and I am so grateful that we have the time that we have to talk about this stuff, not only here in this space but just offline too. Okay, so if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to reach out? What do you prefer?
So it'd probably just be Twitter. So it's just my name, John Murch. I also have a technical SEO weekly newsletter that I showcase some code snippets mostly of different repos I find are fun jazz. So encourage anyone to sign up.
I think we're pretty much coming up to time here. Anything that you want to get in, John? Anything that we missed? There's so much to cover. I mean, we could easily do
Yeah.
episode 2.
Yeah. I mean, I think that covers most of the stuff that was in my mind. There's a lot of, I guess, kind of things on how you plan to build certain processes, like more just like the backfilling, or, you know, just thinking about like understanding your data may change or you may have errors and how to like clean them up over time.
Would you be open to thinking about like a 12-factor app kind of thing and how that relates to how we build? Do you think that would be interesting?
You mean like going through like what 12-factor app is, or like building a 12-factor app?
I think more the former rather than the latter. We wouldn't have time to do the latter. I mean, that would be like, 17 parts or a 12-part series.
Yeah, so 12factor.net. I would encourage anyone who's a developer to read through this doc and understand some of the insights and use cases, because you definitely hit them a lot. But, just some of the patterns on how you do development and just like the process and, how things are set up, because, every app's different. Every app has different use cases of, some of the different things. But, from a kind of high level, you want to be able to, build in certain features that make your life easier.
Awesome. Cool. I would love that. And for clarity, everybody, when I was learning how to build things, John wouldn't talk to me until I digested this website. I don't think I'm kidding. Whoa. My dog's Shadow. So somebody's vacuuming and my dog's flipping out. I hope you guys can't hear that. Okay, well, this has been another amazing episode of Agency Automators. Jordan, do you want parting thoughts? Do you got parting thoughts? Yeah, mind blown.
I've been writing down notes in case you missed it throughout the entire conversation. So a lot to take away, a lot to digest and put into practice. Holy schmoly. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been great. Yeah,
this is really, really great. Okay, everybody. Thank you. See you soon on our next episode. And also, if you could like and subscribe to the channel, that would be amazing, because we've never asked. And last week I was thinking, like, why don't we ever ask? So like and subscribe if you've made it this far in the video. Thanks, nice. Everybody. Right. Be good. Ciao.
Bye.
Does it stop recording?